Virginia. This is about 2 hours.
The question that we'll be looking at today is, how have we moved from a society that nurtured the innocence of our children? We used to be known in the old days, when I was young, as a child protection, child-centered society. And how did we get from that within 3 generations to being known essentially as a child abuse society, one that's dealing with trafficking and child pornography and so forth? And the whole concept of us having always been like this, that it's just more reporting, is something that is very important for us all to understand. Is that true, or is that not true? So we'll be looking at the impact of the sexual revolution on the 3 institutions that have been always known to shape morality. The father of the sexual revolution, Kinsey, 1948, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. I have a copy of the book right here, because I'll say some things today that some of you are going to think is just not possible. It couldn't really be in the book. So I always carry the book with me so that you can check the original. Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, 1953. And as you just saw, the film Kinsey that was put out by Fox Searchlight, starring Liam Neeson, a heroic character in most films. As you saw there, Laura Linney played Mrs. Kinsey, and her statement, I think, is worthy of incorporating into anything that I talk about. Linney said, "Any sort of sexual education anybody's had in the last 50 years came right from the Kinsey Institute. Kinsey changed our culture completely." Now, of course, she thought that that was perfectly fine, but I will suggest that we have other reasons to believe that that has not been to anyone's advantage. So, 3 institutions: family. The family idealized pre-World War II was the father, a mother, a couple of kids, at least often 3 kids or more. Father was expected to earn a living for the family. This is pre-World War II, folks, you know. Father is expected to earn a living. Mother was, and it was a basically egalitarian relationship, even though the father was the head of the household. And mother's responsibilities were largely attempting to maintain the family, attempting to morally educate the children. The family would go to church or synagogue every week, pretty much. And this was the center of, and by the way, women in those days engaged in a great deal of volunteer work if they were financially able to do so. So there was much, we didn't have the same needs, if you will, for social services to enter into people's lives. We had a lot of women who did a great deal of volunteering in those years. Post-Kinsey, we'll talk about why we say that. The second center of education, moral education for children, first you had the family, you had the school. And the school, in the school, the teacher was expected to be a very modest person, well-dressed generally, very agreeable, no bad language. And she also was a model for the children. Everyone understood in those years, as did Captain Kangaroo, by the way, you know, as did Bob Keeshan. Everyone understood that each of us serves as a moral model for the child, for all children. And so you watch what you say, you maintain their innocence as much as you possibly can. And the third, or the first, center for moral imperatives comes from religion. And I'm quoting here from the Patriot's Handbook put out by Liberty Counsel, which I think is extremely impressive, valuable, and useful. And Dean Staver was quoting the founding father, Dr. Benjamin Rush. And this will be an underlying theme as we move forward. And he said, yeah, we had a wonderful revolution, it was very successful, but it remains yet to prepare the principles, morals, and manners of our citizens. So we're going to be looking at the principles, morals, and manners of our citizens, a worldview, if you will, that was held in biblical morality and a worldview that has altered. What are we saying here? Well, we know that sex has been an issue. It's how many thousands of years? So Jeremiah said, your children have forsaken me and sworn by gods that are not gods. I supplied all their needs, and yet they have committed adultery. No, we didn't like that, and thronged to the houses of prostitutes. And we know revolutionaries, whoever they are, whatever the Revolutionary Party happens to be, have always argued for the way to bring about a proper revolution and the control of a population: corrupt the young, get them away from religion, and get them interested in sex. We'll be talking, of course, about sex today. That's in a very well-known book, The Death of a Nation by John Stormer. So here we're talking now about biblical injunctions. We're talking about, quote, revolutionaries. And now what about our dystopian novelists? Well, Brave New World, Aldous Huxley, he asserted that the population could be controlled. A population like ours could be controlled when children were trained early in what he called erotic play. I don't know if you all remember the scene that he has where the children are playing out in the bushes at school, and the teacher is very upset because there's a little boy who does not want to engage in erotic play with the little girls and the other children. And the superintendent comes over and he says, "What's the matter?" She said, "He just doesn't want to play." And so they're taking him to the psychologist for treatment, because we have the concept was that we will sexualize the children early. Once you do that, then they will end up being interested in only the feelies, the orgy-porgies, the soma, and that is to indulge in widespread consumption of pornography, which was what Huxley was talking about, and drugs. So we'll be kind of addressing that issue as we move forward. And here we talk about Dr. Paul Gebhard, who was the co-author of the Kinsey reports. He was director of the Kinsey Institute after Kinsey died. We'll go through this more slowly. And his statement that, quote, children are sexual beings. We made our point that children are sexual from birth. Well, as we move forward, we will be looking at that concept, that world view, because pre-World War II, children were viewed as asexual. They became sexual when they entered puberty and they developed hormones, sex hormones. Prior to that, if you allowed them to grow naturally and normally, then they would go about their business and learn how to live and so forth without getting into a great deal of sexual difficulty. So how do we define Kinsey as such an important guy? Well, the National Research Council in AIDS, sexual behavior, and the intravenous drug use defined Kinsey that way. They concluded that we can divide sexual knowledge crudely into the pre-Kinsey and post-Kinsey eras. This becomes a theme that we will see reiterated over and over and over again, and especially in your laws. In the laws, in the public policies, we will see Kinsey appears throughout the legal system. The pre-Kinsey culture, let's talk for a minute about, I mean, at my age, I remember, I'm back in the pre-Kinsey culture. So Tom Brokaw, we owe him a great debt of gratitude, in my view, because Tom Brokaw launched his body of work, books and other things, in which he defined what the pre-Kinsey culture really was, who these people were. He called them the greatest generation. And he said that those people who won World War II and saved the world from fascism, and it would have been communism or any other kind of isms at the time, that this was a group that had faith in God. Faith in God was part of the lives of the World War II generation. A sense of personal responsibility, a commitment to honesty is the characteristic of this generation. It is how they were raised. And indeed, it is how their parents were raised so that they could raise this generation in that way. So we will be talking about how that view of, in my last book, Kinsey Crimes and Consequences, now it's a new one, stolen honor, stolen innocence. And in sexual sabotage, I deal a great deal with the libel and the slander of our ancestors, the libel and the slander of that greatest generation. Because it was Kinsey that libeled that generation, that said that they were hypocrites and liars, that in fact they were engaged in widespread sexual promiscuity, and that's the reason that we had to end up ending all of our sex laws and protective laws. So the greatest generation that we know of, that won World War II for us, these were people essentially who were reasonably independent. They believed in local control. They believed in local participation in their politics, in their schools. They were part of the decision-making process. They expected to be. They were a religious people. They were a people that essentially looked toward generations and looked toward tradition and believed in tradition, and most importantly understood the meaning and the value of marriage. And when we say marriage, nobody thought of marriage as anything except a woman and a man who commit themselves to a life together and who believe in faith and faithfulness in marriage, and in fact, as I'll show you, chastity prior to marriage. That was not unusual. Chastity was not an unusual standard in those years. So the pre-Kinsey era, when we look at our law, we've had really only two law standards in the United States. We had the common law, which was based on biblical authority, and under those laws, the only legal sex was conjugal sex. There was no legal sex outside of that. Fornication was against the law. Anything else was also prohibited. People were expected to restrain themselves until they married. That doesn't mean everybody did, but it was definitely an expectation, and most people tended to sort of live up to that expectation. And we know that based upon the rates of venereal disease in those years and the rates of what we called illegitimacy or out-of-wedlock pregnancy, which were here and now they're here. So we know that people tended to maintain those standards, or they'd be embarrassed, they'd be ashamed, everybody would know, and so forth, and they'd have a sense of guilt that they carried. Offenders, people who committed sex crimes, would be imprisoned, convicted generally. Capital punishment could be used. Wasn't generally speaking, but it was an ideal that was established. And absolutely no field of human sexuality existed. There was no field of human sexuality. There was no sexologist. There were no sexuality courses. If you went to college, you probably had something in which you had a little hygiene. In high school, you'd have a little hygiene. The girls would be in one class, boys would be in another. They'd learn a few basic things, and that's it. Public morality is what was governed by law. And what substituted then the common law and the biblical authority? Well, you as future lawyers and lawyers know, you can't get rid of one precedent unless you have something that's apparently better, that's more reliable. So the Model Penal Code, and we'll talk about that, the American Law Institute Model Penal Code came on board with scientific authority. Scientific authority would displace biblical authority. The scientific authority said, which was Kinsey, that legal sex ought to be anything that is consensual, that sex laws should be permissive, that offenders should be paroled and pardoned, that psychological treatment could handle most of the difficulties that we had. And at that point, sexology began to emerge, and that field began to dominate society. Under those circumstances, too, private morality would then be governed by law, and it wasn't very much governance. So who was Dr. Alfred Kinsey? That opening clip that you saw talked a little bit about him. If this is the father of the sexual revolution, if this is a man that Fox does a feature film about, I haven't seen one on Darwin, but they sure did it on Kinsey. If this is a man who's had, I think, 4 specials on PBS, right, on Kinsey, at least 4. He's an important guy. He's been an important person in everybody's life. He's been an important person in your life. No one in this room is untouched by the work that that man produced and passed off to the world as science. So was he indeed the staid, church-going, conservative husband and father, the Boy Scout leader? By the way, he got the Boy Scouts to stop, to say that masturbation should no longer be discouraged in the Boy Scouts, in their guidebook. And the esteemed professor of zoology and the researcher at Indiana University. Was he that? Because that is the publicity that was put out all across the country. Or indeed, this is a long one, was he an adulterer, okay, a peeping Tom, all right, addicted to pornography and to masturbation, an advocate of bestiality? By the way, this is all established. I would not say any of this unless it was completely established. And I keep asking the Kinsey Institute to try and say that this is untrue, you know, sue me. I'm ready. Who had, yeah. So, and that's interesting too. Okay, who had sex with his male students and his male research subjects. He was a world famous principal investigator, but this is a man who did sex experiments on infants and children, the father of the sexual revolution, a man who falsified all of his sex data, a man who was a masochist, who circumcised himself with a knife in his bathtub as an adult. He was found in a bloody bathtub by a colleague. By the way, most of this came through one of his colleagues who reported on this in his book, and there was in a biography, and then there was a second biography that confirmed it. They didn't tell me all this. And who repeatedly hung himself by his testicles in the Kinsey Institute basement from a pole. I know, it's pretty weird, which likely led to his untimely death, which was associated with orchitis. Now, if he was any of these things, and if he became the father of the sexual revolution, and if his data continue to be used in law journals and in law cases, and have been used since the 1940s, 1948, 1950s really, would you think perhaps that we might have a problem if any of this would be true? Well, the Rockefeller Foundation funded Kinsey. It was a global media blitz. In 1955, Gore Vidal said that Kinsey was the most famous man in the world for about a decade, but he was this little researcher guy up in Bloomington, Indiana. You know, why would anybody care about him? They would if there was an enormous amount of money to bring his information to the public. And he was above the fold in every newspaper in the country, just about. He was in all of our major magazines on the cover, and wherever you saw him, he and his colleagues, all of whom had to give him their sex histories, this was a secretive group around him, because if he was engaged in these kinds of activities, he certainly couldn't have people around him who would know and who would reveal it. So he took the histories of everybody, and several of his biographers pointed out that he could blackmail everyone. All right, so there they are. They all look very wholesome. They all look like they could be leaders in scout groups, right? And there was only one fellow that nobody really ever saw too much about, and that was this guy down in the corner who does not look exactly like a respectable character. And he was one of Kinsey's colleagues who helped line up sexual partners for him and in his various antics. Kinsey, however, was training global leaders. This is University of Berkeley. Thousands and thousands of future doctors, lawyers, judges, thousands and thousands of future social workers, people who were in legislatures, would be trained hearing what this man was saying. And we'll talk about what he did say. He traveled in Canada, Europe, United Kingdom. This is Copenhagen. Everyone is listening to every word he says, as though indeed he was a major leader guru. Here's in Germany, medical doctors, educators, judges, lawyers, psychologists, legislators, these are gynecologists. He would change the world. And he changed your world. The Kinsey Institute had a soundproofed room where Kinsey and his team filmed sadistic sexual activity. His wife, Clara, was always pictured as a nice lady knitting. She would be involved in these activities in the attic of their home, and she would participate, and she would change the sheets when they got all kind of nasty. She was famous for changing the sheets and bringing persimmon pudding for people at that time. So this was one of Kinsey's compatriots who was participant in many of these activities that took place at the Kinsey Institute and in the library stacks in the Institute. So the question now becomes, was Kinsey a world-famous scientist who impacted on our laws, which I'll describe as we move forward, or was he a manipulative psychopath? Well, Robert Hare has a psychopath checklist that's used by the FBI and law enforcement all across the country, actually throughout the West. And he defines a psychopath as someone who uses charm, manipulation, sex, and violence without conscience or empathy, someone who is violating social norms and expectations without guilt or remorse. Now, kind of maintain that thought as we progress. This is Phil Donahue. You're all too young. How many of you know? Ah, there are a few. There are a few. There are a few. This is Phil Donahue. When I came out with my first book on Kinsey in 1990, and I thought, oh, this will take care of it. You know, I'll just send this book out. I was on the Donahue show and never got invited to another one of those shows, I can tell you that. Because here Donahue is looking at table 34, which I'll show you shortly. I insisted that he put it up. He did not want to put that chart up on the screen. He fought tooth and nail, but I kept saying on an open mic, put the chart up. Let the American public see. Let the American public decide. And so he finally put the chart up. So here he is looking at that chart. And before that, he had said, he admired Kinsey tremendously. He worked with the Kinsey Institute. He said, Kinsey was to sexuality what Freud was to psychiatry, what Madame Curie was to radiation, what Einstein was to physics. He says, comes along this woman and tells us these terrible things, and then he said, well then, we've based an entire generation of education of sexologists on Kinsey. And Kinsey was a dirty old man. But then he says, but he wasn't. He wasn't. The guy was married once, a nuclear family kind of guy. Because indeed, that was the propaganda. And on the same program was a man named Dr. Clarence Tripp. He was Kinsey's photographer. He was also a well-known psychologist by now, and wrote on homosexuality and wrote a book on President Lincoln as being homosexual. He was also a few other things. Tripp said, well, Kinsey listened to pedophiles. They were very careful. They used stopwatches. They knew how to record their thing. This is on the Donahue show, television. Donahue was shocked, didn't know what to say. So he said, well, were they in prison at the time? To which Dr. Tripp replied, oh, certainly not. But they were, in her sense, me, criminals. Whoops, because they were pedophiles, but they were trained observers. Now, does anybody have a problem with those statements? Can you sort of see a problem here? Anybody? Anybody? Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Because I was sitting on that stage and I had a few problems with that statement, and Donahue didn't know what to do. Well, here was the table that we had forced him to put up on, was it CBS, NBC, I forgot, on the screen. He was not happy with that table. I said to him on air, what American is going to defend this? Are you defending this? I said, look at this 5-month-old. A 5-month-old? Who's doing that to this child? I said. And you have, I said, a 4-year-old. 26 orgasms in 24 hours for a 4-year-old? I said, who did that? Who's asking these questions? This is the most vile depiction of child sexual abuse. That, of course, was when Donahue said to Tripp, they were in prison at the time, and Tripp said, oh, no, they were not. Of course not. Now, here's Table 33 that Kinsey produced. I have the book right here. This is the foundational book, the most often quoted book on human sexuality in the Western world. Okay. Table 33. He says multiple orgasm in pre-adolescent. He didn't use the word child very much. As a matter of fact, I don't think I found it once. I think I did find it once in the book. In pre-adolescent males, that's all little boys under 12. So there were 182 children here being abused, timed with stopwatches for Kinsey. Table 32, another group of pre-adolescent quote-unquote orgasm. These were 188 little boys, all of them under age 12, being timed with a stopwatch. Ages, here he says, based on actual observation of 317 males. 2-month-old baby, 28 children, all under 12 months of age. Nobody asked who did this. This was science. Now, we were dealing in Germany with this sort of thing across the water at the time, but we were having it right here at Indiana University. And nobody has gone after them. Dr. John Bancroft, as head of the Kinsey Institute, said in a Yorkshire television documentary that I have, that was produced called Kinsey's Pedophiles. Yeah, it was broadcast all over the United Kingdom. They would never show it here in the United States. Dr. Laura Schlesinger sent a copy to PBS, tried to get them, she said, show this film. They wouldn't show it in the United States. He said all this crap about Table 31 and Table 34. He said Kinsey demystified the subject of sexuality. This is a sexual psychopath. What did he demystify? Do you understand the problem that we have? What did he demystify? Okay. He also went on to say that Kinsey was a great scholar, and so on. This was in the Yorkshire television interview that they did in Great Britain that would not be shown here. Table 30, pre-adolescent eroticism and orgasm. Here he's got 273 victims. Excuse me, but they are victims, okay? They are victims, and no one is asking. I went back to the library, and when I started to see this years ago, I went to the library, I started to check. I said, had anybody talked about the child sexual abuse in this book? I found thousands and thousands of articles about Kinsey, some critical, yeah, not many critical, but some, a few. No one, absolutely no one, addressed this major chapter 5 that becomes the foundation for changing all of our laws. Kinsey said here, in 5 cases of young pre-adolescents, observations were continued over periods of months or years. So some children were being molested for these scientific experiments for months or years. Kinsey, very tricky, manipulative, inserted the word adult in pages 160 and 161 in a discussion that he had about orgasm. I said, okay, what did he call an orgasm, right? What was he calling an orgasm? Pages 160 and 161, he talked about 196 boys who were tested around the clock at various points. And so he would put the word adult in between so that the reader would get confused and think, oh no, he's not talking about children. But he was. He was only talking about the children, 196 children. And he said, some boys suffer excruciating pain, may scream if movement is continued or the penis touched. They'll fight away from the partner. He said there was sobbing, sometimes with an abundance of tears, especially among younger children. That's his, and those are his parentheses, not mine. He said there was extreme trembling, collapse, sometimes fainting amongst these children, these 196 boys, all under age 12. Kinsey concluded they derive definite pleasure from the situation. Well, I read that and I concluded that the only person who would define children this way would be a sadomasochistic pederast or pedophile. Who else thinks like that? No normal human being thinks this way. Here's the topology. He divided the boys into 6 types. And he said, he defined their pain as sexual climax. 3% fainting and collapse. 8% fought the partner. 5% sadism and hysteria. 17% convulsions and cries. Twitching and spasm, 45%. Rigid throbs, 22%. Is that science? Do we call that science? Or do we call that a team of deviants, sexual psychopaths who are torturing little children? And when they see the children fainting, calling those things normal, natural, sexual responses. Kinsey concluded in his data that infants and children are sexual from birth if they are helped by adults or older juveniles. 100%, he said, could be orgasmic under those circumstances. He said that he found 1% incest, but that was because the girls were soliciting from the men and their families. No molestation was reported, none. No harm was reported to children, none. No venereal disease reported, none. This is science? No illegitimacy or pregnancy for the girls, none. No rape, none. And that is the group of children that Kinsey was talking about. Now moving from the children, what would we expect he would say about adults? If you would expose children, so many children, to this kind of violence, well, what kind of scientific data could you be said to create about adults? Well, what he said was 100% of these kids, of course, could be orgasmic. 95% of our males, he said, are engaged in sexually perverse sort of behavior, illegal behavior. And of course that meant that we have to start advocating in our laws to eliminate laws against fornication, against any kind of sexual behavior that we had laws against at that time, because he said all the guys were doing it and there was no harm. He said 65% of men and 50% and 50% of women were engaged in what was he saying? Adultery, right? So the adultery laws ought to be eliminated. The point being, he proved scientifically everybody was committing adultery. If everybody is committing adultery, we have to eliminate the laws that are criminalizing adultery. All right? And then he said that male homosexuality is from 10 to 37% of the society. Therefore, of course, any laws against sodomy ought to be eliminated. And in terms of abortion, he said 22% of our wives and 90% of our single women who are pregnant have abortions, and therefore we have to eliminate laws against abortion. Well, of course, all this was criminal. So who was telling him these things? Who would tell him that they were engaged in these massive crimes? Nobody asked. He also said that he interviewed 4,441 women, and not one woman was ever really harmed by promiscuity or by a rape. Well, if that's the case, we really need to go back, don't we? Let's just all go back to pre-Kinsey era. So no one was ever harmed, said he. Well, of course, now. Now let's look. I just checked. You've got articles now, law review articles this year, talking about Kinsey's excellent methodology. Well, it turns out that 69% of his interviews were carried out during World War II. We're talking science here. During World War II, no one was allowed to give an interview if you're in the military, or if you're working for any war plant, or if you're involved in any way in the defense of the country. So no surprise, it turned out he had 2,446 convicts, 1,400 sex offenders, over 1,000 homosexuals, some hundreds of boys. Now, that whole point means that the people that he ended up interviewing were what? Were they normal? Our guys were fighting overseas to save the country and to save the world. They were not being interviewed by Kinsey. However, there's another little detail that doesn't seem to get into the law journal articles or the law reviews and so forth. And that is, it turns out that one of his key researchers, William Simon, said Kinsey interviewed 18,000 people, but he only used a quarter of the cases in his 2 reports. He threw away 75% of his population. Does this sound wild? If this is one of the most important bodies of research being used and taught in sex education classes today, well, 75% of the interviews disappeared. The remaining 4,500 were just labeled as up to 21,000. The Kinsey, here with the press, financed by the Rockefeller Foundation. Abraham Maslow, how many people have heard of Abraham Maslow? Okay, so Abe Maslow said, well, this Kinsey statistics are not valid. And so the Rockefeller Foundation demanded that he get a statistician. Well, Kinsey wouldn't get a statistician because if he did, what would happen to all these statistics that he was creating? Somebody would have to tell the truth. So he got a young astronomer to pose as a statistician. He never had a statistician. The Kinsey scale. How many people are familiar with the Kinsey scale, please? Anybody? A few? A few more? Yeah. The Kinsey scale. If you Google the Kinsey scale, you'll get 880,000 hits or something. You'll get images of various kinds. The Kinsey scale is the basis of what is taught about homosexuality in the Western Hemisphere today. Homosexuality is supposed to be a 6 and heterosexuality gets a 0. Kinsey claimed that his research found homosexuals are 10 to 37% of the population. To his chagrin, his colleagues, I'll talk about that momentarily, only found 0.05% of college guys in those years that identified as homosexual. I would say that the numbers are increasing, however, radically as children are recruited in classrooms and from TV and from other things, as we'll talk about. So in the late 50s, Kinsey's colleagues, the Eberhards, who were also used a lot in law on obscenity, were very upset to find when they interviewed 200 college males, they're the ones that only found under 1% that were saying that they were homosexual. They said many were as romantic about sex as any girl. Sex without love, premarital sexual intercourse seemed utterly unethical. That was in those days, the pre-Kinsey days. Sodomy was largely seen as homosexual and thus abnormal, so it was very seldom, there was very little of that. Now, you have to understand, Hugh Hefner, his biographies, you know, who knows who he is? Oh. His biographers identify him in college as a virgin, because that is the way most guys and certainly girls were in those early years. So then, deconstructing United States public morals, how do we go from the greatest generation to the me generation, from the 50s to 1969, sex, drugs, rock and roll? And how much of a role did this man play in that shift? What was the covert purpose of the false data? Well, it certainly would be to protect himself and his cadre. And now let's get into what was being said in the legal system, because there was a worldview that began in 1948 in the Law Journal articles, repeated over and over and over again, that people began to import into the legal system. Our laws and customs are designed to protect the family. At the base of the family is the father. Yet, Kinsey found the father is quite different from anything the general public supposed. Okay, what did Kinsey find about the father? He said 95% of our males are committing all of these sexual acts. Therefore, all of these laws that had been protecting families ought to be eliminated. A total cleanup, that was in American Sexual Behavior and the Kinsey Report by very famous guys, and that included top-notch experts all over the country that were writing in that book. Morris Plaskow, Justice Plaskow, Judge Plaskow wrote in Sexual Behaviors in the Law, 1948, a total cleanup of sex offenders, that's dad, right, is in effect a proposal to put 95% of the male population in jail. Virtually every page of Kinsey's report touches on some section of the legal code. This is how come you're all here. In his data and in conferences with the Commission, this is the New Jersey Commission on the Habitual Sex Offender, Kinsey showed behavior in conflict with our legal and moral codes is exceedingly common. Enforcement of the prohibitions of sex legislation are a failure. Our sex crime legislation is out of touch. The law attempts to forbid an activity that responds to a wide human need. And now comes this really interesting stuff. Louis Schwartz, who will become a chief writer, author, they call themselves reporter, for the American Law Institute Model Penal Code, starts way back in 1948 saying, I'm in favor of the individual visionaries who are willing to pay the personal cost to challenge the old moral order. What happens, he says, people resist if smaller numbers of articulate opinion makers launch an open attack on the old traditional faith. Well, who is the articulate opinion maker here that the people will be rejecting? That's going to be Schwartz and his friends. And he says, what are we going to do about the American public? Well, he says sexual penal reforms can be eased into the written law. How? As merely technical improvements. Hold your breath, because we're going to have a model penal code. And the model penal code is going to have only technical improvements. Kinsey's co-conspirators, no bar association, law school journal, or lawyers committee consider laws on sex without the Kinsey study. Kinsey's first volume ended, what's that? A what? An era. It is This is Morris Ernst, who is the co-founder of the ACLU. He says, "It is the single greatest contribution of science to the law in my lifetime, more than the Brandeis Brief." Now, this is Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry, where we'll get into this issue. Full responsibility for sexuality, says the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry. Manfred Guttmacher, who's the twin brother of Alan Guttmacher of the Guttmacher, working with Planned Parenthood. Full responsibility for sexuality should begin at what? The age of what? We're talking a worldview, a legal worldview that thematically began to dominate law as soon as Kinsey's reports came out. Because, said Guttmacher, Kinsey's data were the points by which we steered. Who else? The principal impact of the Kinsey report, says Dean Frank Horrock in the Illinois Law Review, who is dean of the law school. The principal impact will be on the law. It will aid police officers, prosecutors, judges, probation officers, superintendents of penal institutions in judging individual cases. Officials will read it. Defense counsel will cite it. Even when it is not offered into evidence, it will condition official action. Psychiatrists, psychologists, penologists, juvenile and probation officers, they will use the data, and their professional advice will be heeded by the judge. Here, the report will control many decisions and dictate the disposition and treatment of many offenders. Well, in 1973, when the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality as a mental problem, as a disorder, from their DSM, there was one key scientific citation, only one, that could be used, and that was used, and that was Dr. Alfred Kinsey's reports. Well, they weren't reports, it was a book, but you call it a report and it gives you more credit. Kinsey's co-conspirators, 1952. Herbert Wechsler, you all familiar with Wechsler? He was very famous for a while, apparently. In his Harvard Law Review article on the challenge, now we're getting to the model penal code. The challenge, we need a model penal code, he said. The penal code is ineffective, it's inhumane, it's unscientific, it involves punishment, and he says it includes even the penalty of death. We're going to fix all that. We're going to have a new model penal code. It's going to be focused on humanitarian things, on not punishment but therapy, and everything's going to therefore improve. We will have less recidivism, less crime, less violence. Have you noticed that it's less since 1952? Anybody? Has anybody here seen a decrease in violence and in crime and the types of crime? And I like this one. The cultural tendency to overprotect women and children is more detrimental to the victim than the offense itself. And that comes from the report on the Illinois Commission on Sex Offenders to the 68th General Assembly of the State of Illinois. How'd they get that? What does it say? The Kinsey what? Kinsey findings permeate all present thinking on this subject. Isn't history interesting? Kinsey's co-conspirators, I won't have a chance to go into this much, but, and this is very vague, you can't see it, but Dr. Kinsey spun off two major followers. Hugh Hefner, who was revolutionized by Kinsey. He said he was this virgin guy, right? And he's read Kinsey and he said, everybody's been having a great time all this time except me. And he said, I will be Kinsey's pamphleteer. I will bring, Kinsey has done the scientific research, and I'll bring what he found into the general public, into the college world, into the educated world. And Harry Hay, who at the time was married and had a couple of kids, he was also a member of the Communist Party, he said, Kinsey showed that 10 to 37% of us are homosexual. He quit his wife. He formed the Mattachine Society and began the effort to establish cultural diversity, minority rights, and the gay rights agenda. So from Kinsey, from Hefner, we got the pornography revolution, and from Hay, we got the homosexual revolution. All of them thanking Kinsey. That was very nice. Okay. In 1954, now there was an attempt to control and to find out what's going on at the Kinsey Institute. And that United States Congressman B. Carroll Reese chaired the 83rd Congressional investigation, and it was an investigation of philanthropies. And, oh, that's this book, which I urge all of you to read, The Foundations. Very important book for you to understand what has happened in the United States of America and Western world. After investigating 4 major philanthropies, the Reese Committee concluded an elite has emerged in control of gigantic financial resources. He's talking about the philanthropies, operating outside our democratic process for their own political ends. And by the way, in 1919, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Brandeis really said the same thing, that there's an enormous amount of money in the hands of certain philanthropies that do not have our democratic process in their interests, and they are attempting to undermine that process. Well, Kinsey was on the docket, being a recipient of the Rockefeller money as well. And they were told, Congressman Reese was told, that while he was allowed to investigate everything that Rockefeller had been funding, and some of those were pretty bad, while he was allowed to investigate all of those, he could not look at the Kinsey file. The Kinsey research was sacrosanct. Nobody could look at that. Well, they better not. I mean, if anyone had actually looked at it, that could have been pretty disastrous in 1954. And so he said, the lawyer for Renee Wormser said, the investigation of the Kinsey data was thwarted by a combined effort of the Republicans and the Democrats. As a result, the Kinsey file never saw the light of day, although it was a critical part of the planned investigation. Now, that problem has persisted over time. And I had a long talk with Hobbs, Dr. Hobbs, who testified before this committee just before he died. And Dr. Hobbs said to me, because he had been very critical of the Kinsey research, the statistical side of it, and he said to me, if I had been able to see that, you just couldn't believe the child tables. You just couldn't believe them. He said, if I had actually been able to see that and believe it when I saw it, he said, this country would have been a different place in 1954. And I thought, well. In 1955, the American Law Institute's Model Penal Code then gets distributed to all state legislatures. All state legislatures. That code will essentially reflect the Kinsey data in all of its sex crime legislation recommendations. The American Law Institute is an educational affiliate of the American Bar Association, which accredits law schools. Now, you're not going to try and look at that, but I have the handout. And it gives you a flow chart of how this whole process worked, who was involved, who was part of the ALI originally, how they used Kinsey's data, how it went to all of the various, all the various states, where it went first, the ALI Model Penal Code, and where it went all the way in the years and so forth. So it's available when I release you. You're all holding your own pretty well. I know, it's okay. Don't worry. I gotcha. Thank you. Okay, so is the Model Penal Code based on science then, or is it based on fraud? Because it's still used. It's formed the foundation of much that has followed from that. Well, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Breyer said, law cases can turn almost entirely on an understanding of the underlying scientific subject matter. But then the Lancet, the British medical journal, said, Reisman and her colleagues, that was my first book, demolished the foundation of the two Kinsey reports. Do I get a little clap for that, please? Now all we need to do is to get that into the legal system. That's all. That's all. Okay. So the Model Penal Code sex offense section. Kinsey's authorized biographer, what's his name? Gathon Hardy. Oh, there he is, Jonathan Gathon Hardy. Good for me. Stated that the Model Penal Code was, and I'm quoting, virtually a Kinsey document. Kinsey was cited 6 times in 12 pages. Lots, by the way, in those pages. The Model Penal Code justified reducing or abolishing all sex crimes based on Kinsey's sex crimes against children and his other fraudulent data. That's my statement. That's not Jonathan's, that one. That's what I said. Okay. So, Kinsey made up data to prove adultery, promiscuity, that would have been fornication, and that would have been alienation of affection, and that would have been a whole slew of other laws we had at the time. To prove that adultery, promiscuity, sodomy, and other condemned activities in those years were normal, harmless sexual practices indulged in by hypocritical Americans. Now you're going to see how this legalization later on funnels down now into kindergarten, into sex education for little kids. Because we have said over time, as the laws got chipped away, that these were all legitimate activities, legitimate sexual activities. Well, if we make them legal, then people begin to use that as a means to get into the schools, and it started higher up, but now it's worked its way all the way down, sometimes even to kindergarten. Model Penal Code would privatize public morality. Laws controlling public morals, said David Allen in his very fascinating piece he did. He liked Kinsey too, though. Private Acts, Public Policy, the American Law Institute, and the Privatization of American Sexual Morality. He says, laws controlling public morals were deconstructed when the American Law Institute Model Penal Code was shaped, quote, in accordance with Kinsey's scientific discoveries by privatizing most moral questions, as though your morality, remember when the president is doing what he's doing up in the Oval Office, and everybody is saying, well, yeah, but he carries out his responsibilities, you know, fine. So what he's doing in the Oval Office with the little chicky-doo over there, you know, I mean, that's got nothing to do with the decisions that he's making, political decisions. Well, that wasn't the view pre-Kinsey. People's moral behavior was seen as determining the kinds of appropriate wrong or right decisions that they made across the board. So it's a worldview that has shifted. When he said, Allen continues, he says, when the Supreme Court ruled on Roth versus the United States, and Griswold versus Connecticut, he says both cases drew on the Model Penal Code's distinction between public and private sexual expression, which in turn drew on the work of Alfred Kinsey. So, citing Kinsey, he says, the state-controlled, highly regulated moral economy of the past gave way to a new, deregulated moral market. The public, tougher sex laws in those years, they were demanding psychopathic laws that would put people away permanently. At the same time that Kinsey's co-conspirators, and I'm calling them co-conspirators, were secretly reducing those laws. In 1948 and 49, the Committee on Crime and Delinquency Prevention was chiefly concerned about the increase in sex crimes and the need for new laws to protect society from the sex offender. By 1955, however, the legal profession was thinking that some of the, quote, clamor over sex offenses may be due to hysteria. We hear that over and over again. Hysteria. Okay. Well, all right. Even at the age of, okay, Illinois Commission on Sex Offenders, even at the age of 4 or 5, this is how things move in terms of a worldview. Her seductiveness may be so powerful as to overcome the adult into committing the offense. The affair, this, I mean, would actually write this in a book. The affair is therefore not always the result of the adult's aggression. Often the young female is the initiator and seducer. That's Ralph Slavenko, Dr. Slavenko, when he writes in Psychosexuality and the Criminal Law, Vanderbilt Law Review, and that's in 1962. And then we're told in 1965 by the Illinois Commission on Sex Offenders that sex education is the best step in crime prevention that Illinois can make. Moving right along. And here's Morris Plaskow, Justice Plaskow, in the Brooklyn Law Review in '66. This is a mentality that grows across the length and breadth of the legal system, that informs the judges then, that informs what they say to juries, whether they suspect or don't suspect someone. A girl at puberty, says Morris Plaskow, Justice Plaskow, fully understands sexual intercourse, and the fiction of non-consent, which the law sets up, does not correspond to the facts. Now, does anybody follow that? Anybody make sense out of that? Anyone? Okay. She's at puberty, she can understand sexual intercourse, so the law that where she's saying no, okay, that doesn't correspond, he says Justice Plaskow, to the facts of this pubertal young woman. Well, child molestation said legal problems in the deviant society. Georgia Law Review in '69, citing Kinsey on page 1, says child molestation is a relatively minor crime. The absurdity of enforcing most of our sex laws should be obvious to us. That means the most prudish neo-Puritans, I put in the us, let me correct that, should be obvious even to the most prudish neo-Puritans, all right? That is the definition according to the authors there that in terms of child molestation. Now, the label rapist shouldn't ordinarily be used in statutory non-consent cases. A statutory non-consent case. Why? Because the code reserves that, this is the Vernon's Missouri Statutes 2000 comment, proposed code, Missouri Symposium. The code reserves that term for the most heinous sex offender, for one may have sex with a fully consenting social companion of 12 years. So, this is the Missouri Law Review below, 1973. Rape and child abuse carry extremely severe punishment. See, you wonder how we got to where we are. Do you? Anybody wonder here how we got to this place in the United States where we're talking about child trafficking? Does anybody wonder here? Hello? Yeah, okay. We didn't just mesmerize out of nowhere with the kinds of violence to children that we have today. So we're trying to recoup and recover where this process began and how this thinking took place over time. Rape and child abuse, quote, carry extremely severe punishment. And then the next statement is, those few who are punished are dealt with cruelly to the satisfaction of no one but a shrinking, frantic fringe of maniacal moralists. That's Missouri Law Review. Women may have rape fantasies, says Columbia Law Professor Burl Levy in What is Rape and Sexology. The law of statutory rape might well bear some re-examination to see if it's carrying out the old common law idea which was what? Protection of innocent young maidens. Protection being the key term. The older term rape was fraught with negative emotion. It's unrealistic. There's no justification for the perception that the female is a unique creature harmed in some unique way by untoward sexual behavior. Now, when we begin to see these girls in college who go off to a fraternity party and drink too much or are drugged, either way, and who are then raped, and who then can't stay in college because they can't stand it, and the judge has said, well, she drank, you know, and all this. Do you understand? We built this system. This was a legal, a mental mindset, a worldview that was built over time. And it's not just in law, but we're here in law right now, because when I examined thousands of citations, you've got many more in education, in social science, and in medicine, citing to these false data to justify the pathologizing of society. These are just 40 law review articles. I just sort of put them there. But we have thousands of these articles using Kinsey. And exposing Kinsey's phony data did help win with Stephan and Aspen. That was a major military case that I had the opportunity to participate in. And these things could win again. Because you have to inform all of the participants of the background of this information when you're dealing with any kind of case that has sex as its core. So what was the change? Well, the age of consent pre-Kinsey in 48, between 16 and 21 years, most was 18. Today, age of consent really is very flexible, depending upon the age of the offender compared to the victim, so on. Can be 12, can be 18. Rape could get death in 18 states. You know that? Rape, pre-Kinsey, could get capital punishment in 18 states and life in 22 others. There was one state that I think had 20 years. But, you know, that it was the view, the perception of what rape was. But that had to change as you changed the perception of what women were. All right? And Kinsey changed that perception. All right. So now rape, depending if you're plea bargaining, it can get sort of nothing, but it could be 6 months, it could be 4 years, it's been less, it's been more. The more we've had brutal rapes, the more people have started to toughen up a little bit. Statutory rape could get death in 16 states. Now, statutory rape is really not viable if you can prove consent and if the age differential is not severe enough. Seduction, ladies and gentlemen, seduction was against the law. Did you know that? Seduction was against the law. Pre-Kinsey, you couldn't whisper sweet nothings into her ear and then say, but I just can't wait. You know, you couldn't do that. And you could get brought up on charges and pay a lot of money, and all sorts of things could happen. So, and in California, seduction was a felony. How do you like? In California, okay? Yeah, and now, of course, seduction is completely legal. All you need to do is prove consent. She said, but he seduced me. Come on, girl. You know, you're supposed to know better. Well, there's the whole approach to what females really feel and what females will do, and all of that got turned on its head following the so-called data that were collected by Alfred Kinsey. Adultery, of course, pre-Kinsey, prison or fines. Now it's completely decriminalized. Divorce. We had to fault divorce pre-Kinsey. And if someone had been victimized by an adulterer, usually it was the woman in those years. We're moving into greater equality today. But, you know, if it was whoever it was, got everything. Got the car, got the house, got the children, got everything. It discouraged divorce, believe me. And now, you know, after 1973, We got no-fault divorce, no alimony. We had the women with the children in poverty. We have all sorts of problems, fatherless homes. Mom is bringing in the boyfriends because she wants a guy, you know, a male figure for the children and so forth. So we start moving into enormous problems as a result. Child custody in those years would essentially go to mother because she usually would be the victimized party, and now it's basically financially based. Abortion? Well, of course, there were some grounds for abortion, but abortion was punished. The whole concept was unacceptable, and now, of course, legal in most cases, and Phil Klein can tell you more about that. And sodomy, obviously, was prison or fines, and now it's legal enough that we can be teaching it to little children in classrooms. Okay, so things have changed, and not for the better, I would suggest. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, 58,200 children, non-family abductions in 1 year. How many of you knew that? Is that important to know? Yeah? It was not on the front page of the New York Times, was it? No. And it has not been followed up. 58,200, that's National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. 11,100 of these children were under age 12. And of course, we're seeing child pornography, trafficking emerging as a growth industry. Well, this 58,200 is not counting the children who were kidnapped and then raped and murdered. Roughly, we are into about 200 of those a year. These are only counting the ones who then returned within 24 hours of their kidnapping, got back home somehow. Half of them were sexually abused as far as the center, the data that they have. 67% of our sex abuse victims, we finally got data from the National Incidence-Based Reporting System. We finally got data on children under age 12. That's a long story. But 67% of our sex abuse victims now are under 17 years of age. So have things improved? No, they have not. What are some of the outcomes of this criminal fraud? We've got increased male and female adultery, increased bi, homosexual, transvestism, and so forth, increased pornography, which is a drug addiction and other drug addictions, increased domestic violence, increase in divorce and separation, legal disputes over custody, the quantity and the quality of rape has completely changed. The brutality that is involved now in sex assaults is something nobody even heard of years ago. Increased murder and attempted murder, and we can talk about the alleged reduction in crime. What are children's loss of protective families? The normalization of children as sexual beings, that's a very dangerous normalization. Increased child abduction, kin and non-kin, violence, murder of children. In a group like this, we normally statistically should have roughly 25% of the females who would have been sexually abused at some point, roughly 16% of the males. Increased rape of infants and toddlers. Normalization of pedophilia, pederasty, and the brain reshaping harm by pornography. Sex education, I would tell you that sex education as it is designed today fits the FBI definition of grooming by pedophiles. Lincoln Law banned obscenity in the U.S. males. What did he define? What was defined as obscene? Any book, pamphlet, picture, print, or other publication of a vulgar and indecent character. Those were French postcards in those years. Shall be admitted into the mails of these United States. There you go. A drug called pornography. The Christian Post said 30% of women are addicted. I think it's a little bit high, but maybe not. I don't know. 67% of men say they look at least once a month. It's an epidemic in the church community, they said. And of course, that's certainly the same in the secular world. 51% of pastors say that they're tempted by pornography. 67% of sex addicts, professionals with a college or graduate degree. Businesses, here they're talking about several of them, but they're visiting porn, regularly losing huge amounts of money. 60% of Christian men sought out some form of pornography, they said in the last, I've forgotten how long. 90% of 8 to 16-year-olds visited porn online. 17% of women are reporting addiction. And let's not forget abortion. When we start to dehumanize people in the way that we are dehumanizing them, when we strip them of their most basic moral attributes, then yeah, you're going to have well over 1.5 million, say, abortions a year, 3,700 a day. Now, in my research for the United States Department of Justice, images of children, crime, and violence in Playboy, Penthouse, and Hustler, which was, this little pamphlet was distributed all over the country, and all of the 7-Eleven stores stopped selling Playboy and Penthouse. Yeah. However, thank you. However, they're back at it, of course, because we are trying to get the material to people, and it's difficult to do it. Missing and Exploited Center. We carefully studied the executive summary. I have a copy right here, ladies and gentlemen. There you go. Okay? And it was this little thing that caused that amount of trouble. And give heed to the disturbing implications for the protection of children. It must be read by about all the ways that pornography and violence in media affect the incidence of child sexual exploitation and abuse. Now, y'all familiar with Dr. Falwell? All right, so Dr. Jerry Falwell invited me here. He did a lot more than that. It's in my last book. Why is it not a crime, said he, for Guccione, Hefner, and Flint to distribute this? This was in an interview. I was much younger then, yeah. And it was in the Pastor Study, 1986. Dr. Falwell said, I have it here. Let me read this memo. It's unbelievable. Please, and he's reading from the memo. Please read, I have the tape, the video of it. Please, the whole interview. Please review the following relevant portions of the memo from the Office of General Counsel and notify all your staff immediately. And here's what the memo said about this. Please advise all staff that this report should not be duplicated or sent through the mails, because the law says to print or distribute this, that's this, is a crime. So, Dr. Falwell asked the logical question, if it's a crime for the Justice Department managers to distribute this, which is a funded project by the United States Department of Justice that I did, why is it not a crime for Guccione, Hefner, and Flint to distribute this? That is their pictures, because that's what my report was about. We found Playboy was had the highest child image year for children being sexualized was 1971. See, we didn't get to child pornography here without starting somewhere. You understand? We don't have internet child pornography today, just all of a sudden. It was incrementally brought into our lives, starting in Playboy magazine. Remember, Hefner said he was going to be Playboy's what? Good, you were listening. Pamphleteer. So if Kinsey was defining children as sexual, wouldn't Hefner? If he's his pamphleteer? All right, well, that was 16 of those per issue in 1971. They don't do that now. Every once in a while they bring some back. But after my research got exposed, they stopped right away. But that's all right. American University, we had all our coders over age 21. But you should know this. This is lovely. In 1994, Playboy sued me, Dr. Reisman, for libel. But they sued me in Holland. They would not sue me here. Yeah. Please sue me here. You know, I can still bring the stuff to the courtroom. There's not a jury who wouldn't rule on my side. Okay. A kid is a kid is a kid. That's what's going on there, isn't it? It's a picture. Yes, it is. Is she doing that? Is he doing that? Is that a man? Is that a child? End of story. So they sued me in the Netherlands. Why the Netherlands? Because it's the center of child pornography in Europe. So there was an assumption, I suppose, that I'd lose. Well, surprise, surprise. I said that Playboy had been sexualizing children systematically and deliberately since 1954. I said they started in 1954 with little boys and little black and white cartoons, little boys sort of observing things. They slowly desensitized their consumers, and they moved to little girls 10 years later, also black and white cartoons, slowly implying. Then 10 years later, by 1978, we had full-color, full-page images of first cartoons of young girls, fairy tales, being molested, violated by adult men, yeah? And then we moved into incestuous images, photographs in Playboy magazine. Sue me if I'm libeling you. The judge ruled against Playboy and said that my research, my factual findings were uncontested. So, thank you. So, that was really good. The following sanitized slide depicts faculty, staff, and students at the because we're talking about how this thing is funneling down into the classrooms, into children, yeah? Okay, it started at the university level, but nothing that starts there stops there. It will funnel down. So, this slide depicts faculty, staff, and students at the San Francisco Institute for the Advanced Study of Human Sexuality in San Francisco. They are engaged in a public orgy. I have the book here. The Institute launched in 1968, designs, awards myriad degrees in human sexuality, trains in the design of sex education curricula that go into our schools, and grants certificates as therapists, sex educators, and so forth at multiple levels of training. That's safe sex training, that's diversity training, that's training in AIDS prevention, that sort of thing. You can go to this institute and you can, if you wish, join in. Okay, now did everybody see that enough? Okay. So, I tried to show as much as I could show. There wasn't much I could show there. And I did not also include the child pornography in that book, because there is absolutely child pornography that the Institute, which is the Harvard for Human Sexuality Education worldwide, there is child pornography in that book, and that child pornography was sold by that institute to Hustler magazine. You all know what Hustler magazine is? Okay, so it's a pornographic magazine, all right? It's not a financial, okay, magazine, although they apparently make a good deal of money. But so it was sold to Hustler magazine, and the pictures of the child pornography then were published in Hustler magazine alongside a narrative by one of the Institute faculty in which he advocated for an end to age of consent and an end to the incest laws. All right? Now this institute then has trained the educators who go into Northridge and who go into Harvard and who go to all of your major institutions, colleges and universities all over the country and teach human sexuality. We have problems. This is the cover of the book. I can show that to you. And it was, the two authors were ministers. They were reverends. This statement comes from George Leonard. He described some of the training at the Institute. He said, simultaneously, he was there to investigate. He was doing a report for Esquire. I see you. It's all right. Simultaneously, he says, on 17 screens, the sensory overload culminated in a multimedia event called the FUCK-orama. Images of human beings, sometimes, there's Bonnie, even animals, in every conceivable sex act, accompanied by wails, squeals, moans, shouts, and the first movement of the Tchaikovsky violin concerto. I want to show you that they're really classy, right? This is a class act. What can I say? Okay? And now, on the way home, George Leonard, who's a liberal guy, yeah, on the way home, he said, he said, looking back, I was traumatized. He said, I didn't realize how thoroughly I had been desensitized during the time I was at that institute. And he said, but when I thought about it, so I realized that actually love wasn't even mentioned once with all this sexual activity that had been taking place. This is called the sexual attitude restructuring. It's called the SAR, and that is used in all human sexuality training courses, bar none. Now, some will have worse stuff, and some will be a little bit worse, and some will be less worse. Now, I find this fascinating. Their minds are in our hands. The Minnesota Department of Children, Families, and Learning, 1999, and this is the educational institution, National Education Association at the UN, wants to force the SAR, what we just saw, the kind of thing, on all children. Representing the NEA, Diane Schneider said, I pronounce her name right, oral sex, masturbation, orgasms need to be taught in education. Those opposed to homosexuality are stuck in a binary box that religion, remember, and family create. Children should be forced to learn about orgasms, says the National Review, their summary, because they said their children should not be allowed to opt out, was the position of the NEA. Children should be forced to learn about orgasm against their parents' wishes. I would suggest that the National Review has no idea of what they're really going to be forced to learn about it, because it isn't just orgasms, excuse me. Now, looking at this issue, pedophiles are using grooming techniques to gain the trust. This is the FBI. Pedophiles use grooming techniques to gain the trust of children and unsuspecting parents. Now, we could spend a whole couple of hours just talking about the child brain and the undeveloped child brain and the fact that that child's brain is not going to be developed until roughly age 21 to 25 to be able to deal with, in terms of the frontal cortex, in terms of the frontal lobe, to be able to deal with these kinds of stimuli, this kind of arousal state. Risk-taking control is controlled by the frontal lobe. Impulse control, emotional control. All of these data come straight out of the Smithsonian and straight out of the National Institute of Health. Jay Guild has developed a massive body of research on children's brains. The children are being assaulted in the classroom, and they are being assaulted using grooming techniques. The grooming techniques that the FBI has defined. The FBI states pedophiles demonstrate sex acts to children. They give them pornography to teach or to give instruction. They teach children how to masturbate, how to perform oral sex, and to engage in sexual intercourse. Pedophiles use pornographic images to arouse victims, particularly adolescents. They lower the sexual inhibitions. They show pictures of other children in sex in order to overcome the children's natural fears, indicating it's all right to have sex. Well, now, the education. We looked at some of the educators just a few moments ago, the lead educators. Now we're going to look at some of the education. The following are sanitized child illustrations from a popular sex education book that's used in U.S. elementary schools. That such books fit the FBI definition of predatory sex grooming, child grooming, is indeed cause for somber inquiry. Now, it's perfectly normal. Changing bodies, growing up, sex and sexual health. Remember, we've got an undeveloped child brain that is being exposed to these stimuli. Things that pre-Kinsey, in the 1940s, 40s and 50s, would never, most adults hadn't seen. So we're going to teach children fornication through sex education. We're going to teach them heterosexual fornication. That was the word that was used, by the way, fornication. That's the old word. Homosexual, I think. We're going to teach them masturbation. Very important, because if you teach them masturbation, you're able to seduce children much more easily. And we're going to teach them even how to genitally self-exam. And this is being shown to little children as sex education. This is arousal material. This is programming, and that is grooming. You are grooming victims, and you are grooming offenders. And you are doing it under the rubric of institutionalized sex education in the public school system, and private often and parochial. Another thing that's happening to our kids, of course, most of you know, through the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, undecided, and questioning groups, will be lots of conditioning through various materials, certainly in sex education materials in general, and films and so on, and TV, but also a huge push for gay novels. The whole concept, we go back to Kinsey, 10 to 37% of you are born, but even he didn't say born this way. But the idea that this is a genetic trait. We are genetically born this way. Teen gay novels, young adult, they're called young adult. Their reading level is at the 4th grade, 5th month by accelerator reading level. These are for children in grades 9 to 12. All of these are out and proud. They are about bullying. Major publishers are putting these out. The Geography Club above is planned as a major film. It's a kid Brokeback Mountain sort of thing. And all of the books are based on the false genetic claim that homosexuality is inborn, whereas the data are very clear. Until very recently, the majority of homosexual individuals had experienced trauma, sexual abuse, and instead of trying to help people through that and get the offenders, then what we began to see was the seduction of the children. Now that you have massive recruiting, it's hard to say that it was based just on early sex abuse. Now, at the same time, who are these teachers that are coming into the classroom? Look, I have just the women up there, just a few of the women, just a few names of female sex offenders, mainly because there are so many male sex offenders too, but the whole nature of sexual conduct has changed, so that we now have women who are victimizing children in ways that never existed in our human history prior. 4 to 5 million students currently in grades K to 12 suffered some form of sexual abuse by an educator. More than 3 million have experienced sexual touching or assault. I recommend Sesame as a website to look at this. So, did 5,200 Pentagon employees buy child pornography in 2010? It's been a major change in our conduct, ladies and gentlemen. The investigation was halted after 8 months, so we don't know what percentage did. They were found. Senator Grassley reported it. Now, children are sexual beings, yeah? Well, maybe, maybe not. I mean, okay. VIP, very important people, outcomes. Ex-deputy Labor Party Lord Mayor John Johnson, caught with hundreds of child rape, torture, and bestiality images. This was last year, as I recall. Penn State, we know him. And as well as Pennsylvania's Monsignor Lynn. He was convicted of covering up child sexual abuse, and Sandusky, of course, of partaking. So it's time for us to evaluate, re-evaluate what worldview we have gained and what worldview we have lost post the Kinsey era. Kinsey Institute at Indiana University still collects secret sex diaries and protects the mass offenders of child sex atrocities. Kinsey's global reputation as a scientist provides credibility for Indiana University. The Institute receives millions of state, federal funds and philanthropic monies to support special interests. I haven't even gone into Big Pharma and the role that Big Pharma is playing now in all of these sexual dysfunctions, because it's become a massive income for big pharmaceutical companies. So private foundation grants, including Playboy, have supported Kinsey's sexual agenda, which has exploded the nuclear family and destroyed millions of children. Second Chronicles says, if my people who are called by my name humble themselves, pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked, evil ways, then I will hear from heaven, forgive their sin, and heal their land. So, there are study materials. I think a key one that has turned out to be extremely reliable on all of these issues has been very old. The Holy Bible. I recommend also the Patriot's Handbook, which has come out recently for action. Stolen Honor, Stolen Innocence, new book. Sexual Sabotage. Soft Porn Plays Hardball, which I have to redo. The Kinsey Syndrome, DVDs, the Kinsey Cover-Up, the Kinsey's Pedophiles, my interview with Dr. Falwell. The Children of Table 34, there's a major Swiss Kinsey documentary because he's infected all of Western society. The Swiss have done a major documentary on Kinsey. So, I want to thank you for your interest, your attention, your concern, and suggest. Call for a federal investigation into Kinsey's sex crimes, an alleged ongoing cover-up by Indiana University. I'll face them any day. And you better do it soon, I'm getting old. Seek an injunction on the Kinsey Institute to halt potential criminal activity, since they continue to get those records in, and to access all their files, just as what happened just recently with the Boy Scouts. Develop an educational campaign across disciplines to replace Kinsey's fraudulent teachings with the truth. And contact me if you like. And thank you very much, and I will entertain questions.
We have about 15 or 20 minutes to ask Dr. Reisman questions.
I hope you will.
And if you need to go, feel free.
Oh yeah, if you need to go, you can. But I know who's leaving. I have a photographic memory, and I'll see you in the hall, and I'll say, ha-ha, yes, but you hung out good. That's okay. So do ask some questions, please. Did I exhaust you all? Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did. Okay.
I was just wondering why there's been no, investigation into the Kinsey Institute with child pornography. I mean, if there is some there, why has nobody gone in and investigated?
Very good question. Shall I repeat that? Yeah. Why has there never been an investigation for child pornography of the Kinsey Institute? They have admitted that they have child pornography. One of the former directors of the Kinsey Institute, June Reinisch, said that some of the child pornography that they have, the films, are so awful that she can't stand looking at them, okay? So yeah, that's one of the things I think that we need to really fight to take place. They have admitted the possession of child pornography. That means and we know they have lists of some of the offenders. We know that. Yes?
What's happened to all the victims?
Good question. Yes. What happened to the victims? Well, okay. When I first saw this material, the first thing I did was to write to the Kinsey Institute. Oh, I was so naive. I was so naive. I was so liberal. Oh, yeah, those were the days. Anyway, oh dear. So I wrote right away and I said, good heavens, I said, what happened to all these children? What was the follow-up? You know, here I am becoming a scientist, and you're supposed to have follow-up. So you had all these children. What was the follow-up on the children? And the director of the Kinsey Institute at the time, Paul Gebhardt, poor darling, wrote and answered. And he said, well, he said there wasn't really any follow-up. He said it was too expensive, or he said, yeah, we just didn't do it. And he also added, because I asked him, I said, what were the methods used to get these kinds of data from these children? And he said, well, oral and digital techniques were used on the children, is what he said. Well, it turned out when we did the Yorkshire television and they were interviewed, it wasn't just that either. And they were sodomizing these children, no question about that. That came out loud and clear. So we have enormous amount of data that cannot be debated, that could go into any court of law, that if we get our congressional, we almost got a congressional investigation in 1995. We had 51 co-signers at the federal level, and then we had an election, and everything kind of fell apart. But we did almost have it. It was 1995, and we could certainly resurrect that. I had it on my slides, but decided I was going over time, and one of my buddies said, you got to stop this. There are 280 slides here. So okay. So, yeah, so they claim there was no follow-up. Well, to a certain, and we have victims who've come forward. We have victims who've come forward. We have one woman who came forward, and she's on one of the interviews, and her father had worked with Kinsey. She and her grandfather had been part of the abuse group, and she came forward, and we have a young man who came forward. He's not young anymore. But the issue really is that since these diaries are being sent today, people are still writing their sex acts and sending them into the Kinsey Institute. They're still doing that. In 2004, the librarian admitted that people are still helping science. And so that means that there's a record of ongoing crimes, ongoing offenders. So that if we slapped an injunction on those guys and we could get in there and start collecting some of those data, then we would have an opportunity to find out. Now, they did say that they would burn the records, of course, and I did try to sue the Kinsey Institute. They libeled and slandered me, and so I got to get in there and get some of the documentation for a while, and then lost all my money and couldn't continue. My nonprofit said this is just too non-profity, and so we couldn't continue. But we have a lot of verifiable, good, solid documents, so that we could. And I have argued for a long time, if you were able to show the American public where so much of this has come from, that you would really have an opportunity to turn things around to a great extent, which is why they stopped the original investigation that was supposed to happen in 1954 with the Reese Committee, But yeah, they refused, and I do think, by the way, excuse me, they did claim they did follow up on all their subjects. So if they followed up on all their subjects, they had to have followed up on some of those kids. And I can tell you right now, if those kids had turned out to be presidents of this bank and to be highly reputable people here and highly reputable, we would know about it. If those abused children had not ended up suicidal, alcoholic, murderers and whatnot, we would sure know about that from the Kinsey Institute. So since they refused to give that information, we know they're hiding that information. Yes?
I noticed that one of the things you had in your slides was showing instances of child pornography in Playboy and Hudson,
yes.
And those sort
yes.
of things, and how recently those have been sort of taken out, it seems like, or at least it's less common.
Yes.
And I think that, I can't speak for the rest of the nation, but I know that I've had the opportunity to work in a local prosecutor's office that started an initiative specifically for child sex offenders and against child pornography for the entire Central Virginia area. And we've actually had a lot of success in identifying some of these people. And specifically in Virginia, the child pornography laws are very harsh. And in fact, we were able to get an offender recently to plead guilty to hundreds of offenses of child pornography, which were kept on his computer, and he's gone. He was sentenced to, I think, over 15 years in jail. So, you know, that's a beginning. But
It's a beginning.
It is, I think, maybe shows that maybe
Yeah.
the trend isn't so linear, you know?
Well, yeah. What's happened is we've had so many more children raped, murdered, mutilated. One of the points I wanted to make was that not only has rape, quote unquote, of children increased, but the type, because now you're looking at children being raped with objects, as you would know, right? We never heard of such a thing in the old days. You're talking about gang rapes. You're talking about, bad, nasty, awful stuff, which, on top of the rape of the child. And you're talking about forcing children to do things with other children and with animals and all that. That's the nature. The nature of the brutality has gotten so horrific that yes, there now is some kind of an alert backlash, but that's only because it has gone so beyond any human comprehension that people are saying, wait a minute, this is really not, acceptable. So that has happened. But I can tell you this, we're dealing with another huge problem too, and that is that pornography is an addiction. Yeah, no question about that. And impotence, by the way. Pornography will trigger impotence. There's that's global research. Global. Even France. And Italy. Yeah, even they're disturbed enough that they're reporting it. They're saying, hey, our young guys, they can't function here, and they have these lovely ladies, and, it doesn't work. And they've zeroed it in on, big surprise, that when you look at those pictures, that in a very short, I used to lecture to guys and I'd say, now if you're going to look at pornography, I can tell you right now, the definition of potency is with your own power. The definition of impotence is without your own power. So if you need a picture, you're impotent. If you need a storyline, you're impotent. You've handed your masculinity, you've handed your power over to some guy over there who's doing the little, with the puppet thing, yeah? So, and of course then that enriches big pharmaceuticals no end, but Viagra doesn't work, for any length of time anyway, so there's all kinds of backlash on that. The other thing about all pornography is homosexual. Playboy is a homosexual production. And I've done some fascinating research on that from a scientific point of view. When you do an analysis of the variables from abortion to bestiality to zoophilia, on a 50 matrix, you find that there's a complete agreement between Playboy and homosexuality and a complete disagreement with biblical injunctions about those things. The only difference is in the particular selection of a object at that time, and that doesn't even matter because that's tossed out anyway. So all these things confuse men, confuse boys, certainly as more this is more and more boys. But what I was going to say about the abuse issue is, as we've done this, we're increasing incestuous abuse in the household. When pornography is in the household, you're increasing juvenile abuse of younger children. And what happens? Mom and dad find out. I've got the emails coming in all the time. Mom and dad find out, and I had one recently. It was a homeschooled, family, and they just found out that well, they didn't just find out, but they found out that the son, who was 13, was molesting the little girl for at least a year and a half. They didn't know what to do. He'd gone across the street and been looking at stuff over there. And so he came back home, and this was happening. So they didn't know what to do. They went to therapy, and that wasn't. They thought, well, we'll tell the police. Maybe, maybe that'll help. Well, the boy's a registered sex offender now. That's the way things are rolling. So while it's important to give those years, I would say life, life, because all the data are very clear. People are getting out. They're going to repeat that. They're going to repeat that. So whether you know about it soon enough or not, they'll repeat it. So until people understand how they've been manipulated, when I was with the FBI, I was in Quantico, the headquarters, FBI headquarters in Quantico. At the time, they were selling, by the way, Playboy and Penthouse, but they stopped after my speech. So so anyway, when I was there, the head of the Quantico FBI, Roger Depew, it was the behavioral science unit, which had just really begun back in the 80s. Yeah, it was back in the 80s. And they were just doing the profiling and that kind of thing. And Roger Depew, I gave my presentation, which wasn't this, it was a porn, the development over time, how Playboy did it, what followed from that, and that was the whole presentation. And when I finished, Depew asked me to come back and do a piece for the FBI to record it, and so I did. He came in the morning, and he said to me, he said, I want you to know what I did last night. He said, I went home and I called my boys together. He said, round the table, and I got the guys together and I said, guys, we've been had, So I thought that was pretty good. I have a lot of stories like that.
Time for one more question.
Yes.
I'm just wondering what I can do personally. I'm not long from here, but as far as like my children will pay taxes to New York schools, and I've heard recently that 9-year-olds will even be trained of the pleasures of sex, I think through the Planned Parenthood group. Is there a way I could file a complaint or something to that, where even if you homeschool, you're held to that unless you opt out in some way? So I find that offensive when I see all this, knowing it probably links to Kinsey. What would you recommend?
You're the lawyer.
Yeah,
I'm not a lawyer.
You want to head to New York with me?
Yeah. I mean, I look to a major lawsuit myself.
Yeah.
I believe that there's got to be, and I've got all the ammunition, a major lawsuit against Planned Parenthood, against NEA, against the big guys. And a lawsuit that's based upon the fact that the data are clear. They are acting exactly as the FBI has defined the grooming activity of a pederast, a pedophile. Absolutely, no question about that.
Yeah, you need to understand too, the National Education Association has partnered with groups like GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, that are providing, suggesting the reading materials you saw, some of it portraying children as young as kindergarten, first grade, having sexual orgies in bathrooms, and this is reading for that GLSEN is recommending for children in public schools. And the way to approach this is with the National Education Association behind these type of curricula. There's really not a lot you can do. There's strength in numbers though. And it all has to be handled at the local level. And if one parent goes and complains, a lot of times administrators are just kind of brush them off.
You're the first person who came.
Right. But when a group of parents get together and when they start writing letters to the editor and holding rallies outside in front of the school and saying, get this trash out of our schools, you're corrupting the minds of our children, then that's how we affect change, starting with you and me. It's amazing what one person can do. And then there's even more strength in numbers.
I agree and I disagree. Yes, I agree. Local, yeah. But to me, as far as I'm concerned, until we mount a major lawsuit for violating these, for sexual abuse of our children, and all the brain data support it.
Yeah, I agree with that too.
Good.
But for what parents can do.
Yes, yeah, that's good.
Absolutely. Well, again, Dr. Reisman, thank you so much. Let's have another hand for Dr. Reisman. Now you see why I frequently refer to Dr. Reisman as a Rottweiler trapped in a cute little Jewish mother's body. So thank you, Dr. Reisman, so very much. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you.